Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I yield myself such time as I may consume. I want to say a few words about our budget resolution that I'm hoping we will be passing this week and how important it is that we do, in fact, pass this. I also want to clarify a few issues because many elements of the tax reform legislation that continues to be a work in progress. Many elements have been mischaracterized. Others have been made up out of the clear blue sky. But let me start with the budget resolution, and let me start by thanking Chairman Enzi for the very hard work he's done, the great work he's done in bringing together the Republican conference around a budget resolution that I think is very likely to pass. And let's be candid about what this is about. The budget resolution is about giving us the tool to later this year pass tax reform. That's what this budget resolution is about. It's a misnomer, really, when you think about it. The most important substantive item in the budget resolution by far is the procedural tools it will give us to pass tax reform with a simple majority vote here in the Senate so that a minority of the body is not able to block tax reform by filibuster. So that's what this is about. That's what we're endeavoring to accomplish here. Why is it important? Well, the main reason it's so important is because for so long our entire country has been laboring with such feeble economic growth. For the last 60 years prior to the Obama administration, average annual economic growth in America was 3.4%, 3.4%. During the entire 8-year administration of President Obama, we never once had a single year where we reached even 3%. And the Congressional Budget Office believes that we are now locked into the indefinite future of sub 2% economic growth. And that's what we just have to accept. We just have to settle for the fact that we're no longer a booming economy. We're not capable of being a booming economy. There are a lot of problems with this, Mr. President. I think it's completely unacceptable to believe that we somehow, I don't know, because a calendar year turned on a page, or because Barack Obama was elected president some years ago, that somehow it's not possible for America to have the robust economic growth that used to be ordinary. It's not true that we're somehow consigned to feeble growth, and it matters. If our economy is growing at 2%, it takes 36 years to double the standard of living for the average family. If we just manage to get the growth to 3%, and that's less than the historical average, then we can double our standard of living in just over 20 years. It's a big difference. It's a big difference, Mr. President, in the standard of living of the people that I represent, and that's what this is about. So the tax reform that will follow, if we get this budget resolution passed this week, the tax reform that many of us are working very hard on, has got two big goals. Two big goals, certainly for me, and as I've had many discussions with my colleagues on the Finance Committee and outside the Finance Committee, I think these goals are widely shared. The first is it absolutely has to provide tax relief for hardworking Americans. Middle income, lower income, people of modest means many of whom live paycheck to paycheck. There has to be a direct tax benefit for those Pennsylvanians, those Arkansans, those people all across America. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's very clear. It's no question there's going to be a reduction in the rates, tax rates that are applied to income for hardworking Americans. There's going to be an increase in the standard deduction that they can take. So that means just a bigger chunk of their income that doesn't get taxed at all. That's absolutely going to be a feature of this tax reform. We're going to increase the child tax credit so that people who have the cost of raising family with kids are going to get a credit for that, towards that cost. That's going to, the combined effect of these things are absolutely going to lower the tax rates for hardworking Americans, for lower and middle income families. And if it didn't accomplish that, it wouldn't even get out of the Finance Committee, much less pass a vote on this floor. So that is number one. There are still dials to be turned, rates to be set, exactly where the various brackets begin and end. These details are still a work in progress, but that goal is going to be achieved. That's item number one. But the other item is really important too. This is the process by which all of these very same families get an indirect pay raise. They'll get a pay raise. It'll happen over time, and it'll happen in different ways, and that is by creating the incentives to maximize economic growth. To get away from this sub 2% barely growing economy we've been tolerating and get back to something closer to what's normal for America, an economy that's growing at least 3%. Well, what happens if we have stronger economic growth? Well, I mentioned before, we increase the standard of living much more quickly. People get to see their kids having a better life, a better standard of living than they had, and they can see that that trend is going to continue. It happens because new businesses start to get launched again. It happens because existing businesses expand. Both new businesses and expanding businesses hire more workers. When you hire more workers, especially at a time when most economists think we're at something close to what they consider full employment, it puts direct, immediate upward pressure on wages, which is what we've been waiting for. So not only will a working family discover they owe less money to Uncle Sam, but they're very, very likely to quickly be in a position where they're getting a pay raise because their employer has to pay them more to keep them. Because what we're going to do is create more demand for workers. So how do we do that? Well, one of the ways we're going to do that, I hope, and this is, again, it's a work in progress, it's underway, but we ought to make our business tax regime, our big business tax code, competitive. Anyone who looks at this honestly knows that our tax code is not competitive today. American workers and businesses lose out to competition from overseas because overseas, other countries have much more competitive tax codes. You know, it could be, it's entirely possible, I think you could make the case, that the American tax code is the worst in the world. It's that bad. And when it's that bad, that means our workers, our businesses are much less able to compete. So we're going to try to fix that. That means lowering the rate on income tax for our business to something that's comparable to what the rest of the world pays, rather than the extremely high outlier rate that we have today. It also means, Mr. President, we ought to allow our businesses to expense capital when they put it to work. What does that mean? That means when a company goes out and says, well, we're going to buy a new piece of equipment, a new piece of machinery, a new vehicle, a new backhoe, whatever it might be, you allow the company to recognize that expense when the expense occurs for tax purposes. That might just seem like common sense. People might say, well, why wouldn't you do that? Well, we don't today. For a large category of new equipment that businesses go out and purchase, even though they have to buy it in the year in which they put it into service, they have to come up with the cash, they don't get to reduce their income accordingly, except over many, many years. Well, what that means is it makes it effectively more expensive to buy that equipment. They have to pay tax on money they don't have. Well, that means they buy less equipment. What difference does this make? Well, it makes a lot of difference. There's a direct effect and there's an indirect effect. The direct effect, by allowing businesses to fully expense the capital that they put to work, we're going to encourage them to buy more items. So that's going to be more work, more production for the kind of machinery and equipment that these businesses are likely to buy. But it gets better than that, because when businesses deploy that capital, when they buy a new piece of equipment, a new piece of machinery, upgrade their software, whatever they're doing with this capital expenditure, they're making their workforce more productive. They're making their employees able to produce more in a given hour, a given day. And when workers are more productive, that's when a business can afford to pay them more. In fact, has to pay them more. That's where pay raises come from. It comes from productivity growth. Productivity growth comes when capital gets put to work. We're going to encourage more of that, and that's going to result in higher wages, higher income for the people we all represent. Third point I want to make about this tax reform is it's very important that we fix a broken part of our code that deals with overseas subsidiaries of American firms and foreign firms that operate in the United States. That part of our tax code is a disaster. We've all read about the corporate inversions, for instance, where an American-based company seeks to be acquired by a foreign company for the sole purpose of lowering their tax burden. It happens. It happens because our tax code drives it. We've all heard about the $2 to $3 trillion of profits that American companies have earned in overseas subsidiaries. They won't bring the money home because if they were to, they'd have to pay another huge tax on top of what they've already paid in the jurisdiction in whatever country their subsidiary operates in. So why would we tolerate a system like that? We have an opportunity to fix that. And if we fix that, then huge sums of money is going to come flooding back into the United States. And that's going to get invested here. And that's going to mean more businesses, new expansion, more hiring. That's going to be tremendously constructive for our economy. And going forward, we will eliminate this perverse incentive to have your multinational company headquartered anywhere but the United States, which is the case today. So, in short, Mr. President, this is our opportunity to begin to achieve the growth we've been waiting for. Ever since the Great Recession, we have not had the kind of economic growth that used to be normal for America. A completely archaic, terribly unfair, ridiculously complicated tax code is part of the reason why. Now you might ask, well, how did we used to have such strong growth with this tax code? Well, the fact is most of the rest of the world has been about the business of improving their tax code while we have not. This is our moment, our opportunity to begin to catch up, and we could do it in a big way as long as we pass this budget and give ourselves the tool to do so. This budget resolution creates the opportunity to do tax reform. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have criticized the fact that we are setting up a process, we're using the budget resolution so that the subsequent tax reform can be passed with a simple majority vote in the Senate. They've criticized that. They've suggested to varying degrees that somehow that leaves them out of the process. Let me just be very clear, that is categorically untrue. The tax reform bill, we're working on the ideas for this now. When we actually get to drafting the specifics, it's going to happen in the Finance Committee in the Senate. It's going to happen in the Ways and Means Committee in the House. It's going to be public. The documents are going to be disclosed before the markups begin. And it's going to be open to amendments. My Democratic colleagues on the Finance Committee are going to be able to offer whatever amendments they like. They can work with us on shaping this. And I hope they'll join us in voting for it. It's much better if we could end up passing this with a big bipartisan vote and a tax bill that absolutely does lower the direct tax burden on lower income and middle income families and encourages more economic growth ought to be something that could be broadly supported. They will have every opportunity to weigh in. They will have every opportunity to amend it. And there is nothing about this procedure that in any way excludes Democratic participation. What it does do, though, is it says we will not be held hostage by a minority that wishes to thwart this. We'll have the ability, if we can persuade at least 50 senators and a vice president who's so inclined in the chair, we'll have the ability to pass tax reform. I think it would be malpractice for us not to create the opportunity to do tax reform with a simple majority, since we have that vehicle available to us, and I believe we're going to pass it today. Another point I'd like to address is the discussion that somehow we're going to blow a hole in the deficit with this. Couldn't be further from the truth in my view. What our budget resolution does is it allows the Finance Committee to report back a tax reform package that will, by a very particular and very precisely defined process, be deemed to forego $1.5 trillion in federal revenue over the next 10 years. But when you start to unpack that, you realize that in all likelihood, if we do this tax reform right, we're going to reduce the size of the deficit over this 10-year period. We're not going to increase it. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, the $1.5 trillion in foregone revenue contemplated by the budget resolution is very misleading because it pretends that the current policy we have of a number of temporary tax relief measures is going to go away. It pretends that we're not going to continue those, we're not going to extend them. In all likelihood, Congress routinely extends them, so they will probably be extended. That's worth about $500 billion of that $1.5 trillion. So what we're really talking about is $1 trillion less revenue over the next 10 years. And you have to keep in mind, that is on a base of about $43 trillion. So it's something on the order of, call it 2.5% of projected federal revenue. So the question to ask, I think, is how much extra economic growth will it take to fully offset $1 trillion worth of foregone revenue? Well, that math is pretty easy because Joint Tax and the Congressional Budget Office have quantified this many times. The answer is something approximately 0.4%. 0.4% of extra economic growth in response to the tremendously pro-growth incentives that we want to put into this tax code will fully offset that. So the Congressional Budget Office is projecting on average for the next 10 years our economy is going to continue at this feeble 1.9%. That's their number, 1.9%. If getting these reforms right, if lowering the tax burden on working families, if allowing business to expense, making our international and business tax codes competitive, if we do that right, I have absolutely no doubt we can generate much more than an additional 0.4% growth. And we'll have an opportunity when we get the specifics. We'll have many analyses that we'll be able to look at to address this question of just how much extra growth we will have. But in my view, it's entirely plausible. It's extremely likely that we will significantly surpass this very modest hurdle of 0.4% of growth. Finally, the minority leader made a reference to this being a big tax cut for the wealthy. I would remind my colleagues, we can have differences of opinions, we can have a debate here, and we will. But let's remember, this tax reform bill is not written yet. The two big goals I mentioned, I think, are universally shared on our side of the aisle: tax relief for middle-income working families and pro-growth policies. We haven't written the details yet. We haven't established exactly what the brackets will be, exactly what the rates will be, where they will kick in, how the pass-through rates applies. There's a lot of important details that are going to be worked out in committee, which is exactly the way my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have insisted we should be doing. And that is the way we should be doing. But it also means, since that product is not yet finished, it is not possible for anyone to pull out a number and say X% of this bill is going to go to this category of people. That is not knowable because the bill has not been finished yet. So, Mr. President, I am thrilled about this opportunity that we are going to create this week to pass the tax reform later this year that will allow us to achieve the growth we've been waiting for, and that means allowing my constituents, Pennsylvanians, and people all across America to achieve the standard of living that they deserve, that they're working hard to achieve, and that they will be able to enjoy. I yield the floor.